just in case you're interested, so far I've got contracts for the one intro class this summer, although I know I'm listed and I have students scheduled for my logic, so I expect that to happen as well. And I've also just been offered at least one course so far in the fall on a Friday evening at Chugiak High School, probably. But still waiting, of course, officially staff are doing all the courses on main campus, so I don't know what the future holds for all of that. But I just found out that one, they asked me that one today. But today we're looking at Daniel Dennett as our philosopher, extraordinaire, whatever. Of all of the philosophers, although I think Zizek, I look a little like Zizek. But Daniel Dennett, I really look a lot like Daniel Dennett, except for I've got more hair still.
Right.
So that's kind of neat. We can talk about lots of things about Daniel Dennett. It's still 3 minutes early yet, though. So what should I do here? I'll say about this.
I mean, they talk so slow. By the time they said no, I made it already, Anyway, he's really great. Here he is, Jeff Foxworthy. Okay, make him happy. Here, Jeff, come here, baby. All right.
Thanks very much, y'all. I am from the South. A lot of people seem to have the idea that everybody from the South is married to their sister and has seen a UFO. Well, I'm just dating my sister, and I couldn't swear it wasn't a weather balloon. We gotta have that reputation in the South. People think we're goobers because of the way we talk, And it is hard to be cool with a Southern accent. Because it's like people from New York, they come down South, they just fit right in. It's like, yo, pass the freaking grits, y'all, all right? You can't do that with a Southern accent. You could take a Southerner to a nude beach on the French Riviera, we'd be out there going, damn, this looks like a good place to fish here. Ed, bring the cooler. I found a spot. Going up to naked women. Hey, you don't know where we pick up some red wigglers, do you?
I think that was a dirty joke.
The idea everybody from the South is a redneck. Now, that's not necessarily true. I've been all over the country. There's rednecks everywhere. The problem is a lot of people don't know if they're a redneck or not. So I came up with a test to kind of help you out. Things like, if your richest relative buys a new house, and you have to help take the wheels off of it, you might be a redneck. If your mother doesn't remove the Marlboro from her lips before telling the state patrolman to kiss her ass, you might be a redneck. If your family tree does not fork, you might just be a redneck. A lot of people drinking here tonight. Hope you're using designated drivers. I think this is a good program, Anything's safer than the way we used to do it. Hey, dude, get up. Give us a ride home, man. Oh, God, I think he threw up, Tony. Come on, what do you say? We'll buy you a beer. Come on. The only problem with the designated driver program, it's not a desirable job. I mean, because basically you're just babysitting people whose biggest ambition is to pee in the parking lot or something. But if you get talked into doing it, have fun with it. Like at the end of the night, drop them off at the wrong damn house. Preferably in their boss's front yard or something. Where are my flamingos. But don't drink and drive, it's not funny. I know this as a kid. I was a little kid. I was right on the front seat of the car with my dad. And he'd been drinking beer all day long, and we got pulled over by the highway patrol. And the officer walked up to my dad's window, and he went, "Excuse me there, sir. Could I see your license, please?" "No, sir, I don't need a cold beer. I don't think you do either." "Mr. Foxworthy, do you know why I pulled you over, sir?" "Well, it concerns that vehicle you're pulling behind you." "No, sir, it's not against the law to tow a boat, but we do require you put it on a trailer." "Could you ask your friends to get out of the boat, please, sir?" "No, sir, I don't give a damn if the fish are biting. Could you ask your friends to get out of the boat there?" "Hell, you dropped your skier about a mile back there." You guys are a good crowd. I'm not even going to ask who's single and who's married, because married people can't clap as loud. The chain only goes this far, you know.
Okay, so for those of you that didn't know it, that was humor. And we might ask, what is humor for? And Daniel Dennett tells us. Inside jokes. What?
So it is my great pleasure and distinct honor to introduce to you today Professor Daniel Dennett, Austin B. Fletcher Professor of Philosophy at Tufts University. Professor Dennett received his BA from Harvard University in 1963 and his doctorate degree from Oxford in 1965. He then promptly went on to take the philosophical world by storm. In addition to being author of over 300 scholarly articles on various aspects of philosophy of mind, he is published in journals ranging from artificial intelligence and behavioral brain sciences to Poetics Today and the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. And he reminded me today an article in the Journal of Philosophy, a history article on Descartes. So keep it running down. He is also the author of numerous highly influential books. His first book, Content and Consciousness, appeared in 19,000.
So I'll start. I just keep moving it fast through. This isn't really a very good recording. But so, Inside Jokes, it's the title of one of his books. I'll go to the book itself. And notice the subtitle is Using Humor to Reverse Engineer the Mind. For one thing, this is a more recent book of his, but it's one that I've used in my logic classes when I discuss fallacies, because for years I've thought that fallacies can be presented in a more interesting way by comparing them to humor, since after all, a fallacy is essentially a joke, if you think of it that way, because a fallacy are premises and a conclusion, but the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. And so basically, if you present it as humorous, it comes across as a joke. There are lots of different kinds. And so it's kind of interesting to compare the types of fallacies with the types of jokes. And you end up noticing that certain comedians will use a particular type of fallacy over and over again. So that's their style, in a sense. And I notice Jeff Foxworthy seems to be using puns, basically, on the nature of redneck, for example. the fallacy, the associated fallacy could be either two different types. You could have equivocation, which is where you're using the same word with two different meanings. So if you're using the word in one premise, and then you use the word again in the conclusion, but the meaning is different, you've actually got the fallacy of four terms. It's not really even a legitimate argument. But it's also referred to as equivocation because you're using the same word in two different ways. You're equivocating. If you're using instead an entire phrase out of in different ways, then that is called amphiboly, which you could look up. That I think is usually unusual. People don't usually know what that one means. But notice it's where you have an entire phrase or something that's misinterpreted or used in more than one sense. One morning I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got into my pajamas, I'll never know. You know, that kind of fallacy, essentially. Or it could be ambiguous use of pronouns. We took some pictures of the native girls, but they weren't developed. But we're going back again in a couple of weeks. So developed. The girls are the pictures, you know. By the way, we don't have that issue anymore because, of course, with digital photography, we don't develop pictures. Sorry about that. But so inside jokes is his attempt to, one, be funny. And if you read the book, you'll notice that he has a plethora of various jokes throughout. But they're all geared towards demonstrating a particular aspect of humor that he's focused on in that particular chapter. So, of course, he's looking at different kinds of jokes. Some of them are pretty funny, others are kind of like, but it's very interesting. The overall attempt, though, in trying to figure out why do we have humor in the first place, from an evolutionary standpoint, what you've got is the idea that everything that we do basically is a behavioral development in response to some environmental stress or stressor. And so we end up wondering, well, why do we have jokes? Since that doesn't seem to have a very important relationship to, a life of claw and what is it? Lex talionis, the law of talon and what's lex talionis in English? The law of tooth and fang? Is that right? Is that what we call that? Of course, it's the law of the talon. Lex talionis is the Latin. But the so what is the point? He says, he concludes basically in trying to figure out why we have humor. He says it's the reward that we get for solving problems, or as he says, debugging. So basically, if you think about it, when we're laughing at a joke that is essentially a fallacious argument, the reason we laugh is because we're rewarding ourselves for catching the mistake. Right? So it's debugging. We're in a situation, there's something wrong with it. Aha, we solved it, and we reward ourselves for solving it. Mentally, we have like biochemicals that make us feel good that we've solved this problem, right? And if you have enough exuberance over that sort of thing, it's aha, and it can become absolute laughter. And of course, then we've actually made use of this. Obviously, the Greeks had humor. I'm thinking Lysistrata and other frogs. I mean, there's lots of plays that the Greeks obviously used. I have a picture book of humor for the Egyptians, you know, where they've got the baboon calling, you know, the strokes for the oarmen, you know, that are, you know, pulling the boat, you know. So, you know, I mean, the joke there, of course, is that they're calling the guy who's in charge a baboon, which I think is still universally understood to be a critique of the boss, right? You know, I mean, if we had a picture of a baboon with blonde hair sitting in the Oval Office, I think everybody would get, you know, understand, you know, the nature of the joke. But so he's, in a sense, with a team. Notice he's got Matthew Hurley and Reginald Adams, who both, by the way, as far as I know, are graduate students of his, trying to solve. So here's the summary. Some things are funny, jokes, puns, sitcoms, Charlie Chaplin, The Far Side, Malvolio with his yellow garter's cross. But why? Why does humor exist in the first place? Why do we spend so much of our time? By the way, Malvolio with his yellow garter's cross is a reference to being gay, if you know, you're familiar with Shakespeare. In any case, why do we spend so much of our time passing on amusing anecdotes, making wisecracks, watching The Simpsons? In Inside Jokes, Matthew Hurley, Daniel Dennett, Reginald Adams offer an evolutionary and cognitive perspective. Humor, they propose, evolved out of a computational problem that arose when our long ago ancestors were furnished with open-ended thinking. Mother Nature, also known as natural selection, cannot just order the brain to find and fix all our time-pressured misleaps and near misses. She has to bribe the brain with pleasure, so we find them funny. This wired-in source of pleasure has been tickled relentlessly by humorists over the centuries, and we have become addicted to the endogenous mind candy that is humor. So that's kind of just a summary of one of his books. But if we look at all the rest of the books that he's written, as far as I can tell, he's mostly been at Tufts. By the way, one of his professors was Quine. He's also connected to Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens, because he's also considered one of the four horsemen, so-called, of new atheism. And yet, I should find this. There he is. I need a trigger warning for anyone regarding Charlie Rose. Notice it's Bill Moyer.
Dennett is here, trailing storm clouds of controversy. He's a philosopher, a disturber of the peace, a provocateur who says the confrontation between religious faith and the modern scientific world is not going away. Long ago, Daniel Dennett introduced the first frisbee into Britain when he was studying at Oxford. Ever since, he's been releasing arguments like thunderbolts aimed at notions of the supernatural and the ranks of the pious. He says the world is polarizing between the rational and the faithful, and it's time to break the spell of religion. That's the title of his latest book, Breaking the Spell, and is being hotly debated from pulpits and talk shows to faculty lounges and op-ed pages. It's just the latest of many books, including Content and Consciousness, Freedom Evolves, and Darwin's Dangerous Idea. He teaches at Tufts University, where he heads the Center for Cognitive Studies. He's a self-described bright, the new word for atheist, and wrestling with God is not the only thing he does. He makes cider, picks blueberries, is a sculptor, and a sailor. Charlie had reached out to him a few weeks ago, and I'm here to welcome you, Daniel Dennett, to the show in Charlie's stead.
Bill, I'm delighted to be here.
People who go around America confessing that they are proclaiming that they are atheistic are not going to win any popularity contests.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I find that everywhere I go, I find people, particularly young people, coming up to me and saying, "Thank goodness you're doing this. We're so grateful to you." You know, it's the first time we've heard a sane adult say anything like this. Coming out of the closet as a bright is actually, I think, a very important political thing to do. I know a lot of people in many states would never dare do it.
Where did that term come from, bright?
Now, a couple of ex-high school teachers in California came up with the idea, and they started a website, started a movement. It wasn't my coinage, although a lot of people think it was. I just decided this was worth a try, and so I decided to write about that and did an op-ed piece in the New York Times.
Why not just use the old-fashioned term for atheist or free thinker, which is a very popular name?
Well, I think the idea was we needed a new happy term, something a little bit in your face, something with a little bit of an edge so it would catch people's attention. It was modeled very deliberately and very consciously on the homosexual kidnapping of the word gay, which took some time. It was not all that popular at first, but eventually caught on, and I think everybody would have to say it was an important political move.
When you say these young people come up to you and say, thank you, what are they thanking you for?
They're thanking me for confirming their hunch that it is quite all right to be an atheist, quite all right you can be a moral person, you can be a deeply engaged person, and you don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it. In the same way you could stand up and say, I'm a Baptist, or I'm a Buddhist, you can say, I'm a Bright.
There's a church in Austin, Texas, where I went to the University of Texas, a Presbyterian church that kicked up a dust storm of controversy itself recently when it admitted an atheist into membership. The pastor says they've gotten letters from both sides. The Christians write to demand, quote, how can you let someone join the church who cannot affirm the divinity of Christ? What's wrong with you liberals? The atheists get letters asking, how can you as an atheist surrender your mind to a superstitious institution that gives birth to the Inquisition and the Crusades? That pretty well sums up the polarity, doesn't it?
I think it does, but I don't think we have to be so polarized. I mean, I don't go around advertising my atheism all the time. Anybody asks me, I tell them. I don't think it's that important, quite frankly. I'm not a militant atheist. In fact, I have a lot of church-going friends, and I even go to church myself on occasion.
You go to church? Where?
In New England, I was raised a Congregationalist, and
You were raised a Christian?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Did you think
I went to Sunday school, and I learned the hymns, and I still can recite some psalms, I'm pretty sure. Sure.
Did you think that the life of Jesus was the greatest story ever told, as many of us believed at the time?
I thought it was I thought it was a wonderful story. Yes.
What
I didn't believe the supernatural part of it.
Even then, even as a child?
I can't remember. I guess I did for a while. But as soon as I thought about it seriously, I rejected that. Sure.
When did you become an atheist? What caused the shift?
There was no dramatic shift. I was, I suppose, a teenager, thinking about what made sense and what was plausible, and I saw through other supernatural things just fine. I didn't see any reason to believe in poltergeists or any of the other crazy supernatural stuff in astrology or trance channeling or anything like that. I thought, well, I don't see any reason to believe these stories just because they're several thousand years old.
Did you raise your children to be religious?
No, but we did take them to church so that they could hear the music and learn the songs, and we love Christmas, and we have a Christmas carol party that we've had for 25 years, and all our friends come and we all sing the music.
What about your grandchildren? Do you want them to be raised in a tradition?
Yes, I'd like them to know the tradition. I have a grandson, and we've talked about this. He's not, in fact, going to Sunday school now, but that would be fine if he did.
We went on Saturday night to Carnegie Hall for Brahms' Requiem. Now here was a man, a great composer, who had no place in his life really for organized religion, and yet that music opens with the words, "Blessed are they that mourn, for they will be comforted.
Yes.
And then the fourth movement of the Requiem draws on the 84th Psalm. How lovely are thy tabernacle, O Lord of hosts. My soul longeth, yea, even fainteth, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh crieth out for the living God. Blessed are they that dwell in thy house. They will be still praising thee. Where do you think such longing arises?
Well, I think the longing for comfort is not hard to understand. Death is a terrible blow, and our species is unique in all the species on the planet in being able to imagine our deaths and knowing that we're going to die and not liking that idea. And I think we have two competing urges. This is not so much my theory as the theory of several other people that I discuss in my book. One of them is, and these are rooted actually in our biology. They're even rooted in our genes. And one of them is to get away from a corpse. It's dangerous. It's a source of disease. It is something to withdraw from. At the same time, this is a loved one, and that's something to approach. So we're tugged in two completely different directions, and you can't just leave the body of a loved one. You have to do something. And out of that grows the rituals, the burial rituals, and out of that grows the sense that that person is still there. After all, your head is still teeming with, well, I wonder if she'd like, and what would she think of, and can she see me now? All of these habits of mind that we have about anybody that's close to us, whether we love them or hate them, actually. Those habits don't just stop when a person dies. And so it's very natural to understand how those habits could be turned into a sort of hallucinatory presence.
Joseph Campbell once said to me that he thought religion may well have begun when the first woman realized that was a corpse beside her and wondered where her husband had gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But that longing expressed in the woman, that longing expressed in the 84th Psalm, moves on from just the desire for comfort to try to touch something transcendental. At least that's how I read this powerfully poetical language.
Well, Brahms' Requiem is one of the great masterpieces of all time. I've sung it and loved it for years.
What is it touching you?
It touches many chords in me. I can be reduced to a shivering, trembling hulk by Bach, by the St. Matthew Passion, by Brahms. I've sung in a lot of choirs and choruses in my day. And the music moves me tremendously.
Biologically? Is that a biological?
Of course it is.
What do you mean by it? You said religion earlier. You said religion has biological roots. What do you mean by that? You say this response to this great music is biological.
Well, it's partly biological. There's a biological basis. All the great composers knew how to pluck the heartstrings, how to create effects that were deeply moving. Bach was a genius. He did some very clever things. His great chorale cantatas, for instance, he took hymn tunes, the chorale tunes that were already deeply familiar to the people that were coming to church. They were like Home on the Range or Christmas carols to us, and then he reworked those into these very moving cantatas. He knew what he was doing. He was a master at what I would call mimetic engineering. He was great at redesigning musical artifacts to strum every chord in every person's heart.
But I would not dare put myself in Brahms' mind, but don't you think he was reaching for a spiritual, what he called a spiritual response, not a biological response? I want to make sure I understand that difference.
Of course he was. Spiritual in the sense of having to do with your mind and what you know, your culture, the ideas, the stories that matter to you and why. We all of us, we start with our language, our mother tongue. This shapes our minds in unimaginably many ways. We imbibe stories, folklore, the Bible, the Quran, whatever the texts are, but also everything else. Television, George Washington and the cherry tree. All of this lore furnishes our minds. And it's all available to be spoken to be rung in by poets, composers, preachers. Preachers are, I think that a really good preacher
Move it along a little
is
bit.
like a jazz musician. It no longer helps us. But we can't get rid of it. It's in our genes, but we don't have to indulge it. We don't have to succumb to it. Some people do, but we don't have to. We've learned how to work around our sweet tooth. Now, do we have a sweet tooth for God? Yeah, we sure do.
And you think there's a surfeit of that sweet tooth for God, right? That's what I take. One of the things I take away from your book is that you think we have a surfeit of belief in God.
No, actually, I do not know. Because here's what I don't know. And I say in the book, until we do more research, we just can't tell. We have sugar and we have saccharin. Saccharin is maybe the healthier substitute for sugar, and they both satisfy our
Not this
craving.
week.
Now the question is, religion, is it sugar or saccharin? If it's saccharin, and we cut it out of our diet, we may be in real trouble. Because then we may indulge our cravings, whatever they are, with things which are worse for us than religion.
See, I think this is where your critics really come after you. They say you think that God can be put to a scientific test like everything else. And if God is God, God is beyond the observation and verification process of science.
Oh, God is very definitely beyond the verification process of science. God has been designed to be beyond the verification process of science. This is one of the classic adaptations of religions, is to create this gulf so that science can't get anywhere near God. That's true. But science can understand that very fact.
You say that
Science can understand how religions evolved and why, by the way, that idea is completely absent in folk religions, which are the ancestors. The idea of God being, as it were, beyond science. They don't make a distinction between science and religion. In folk religions, it's all the same. It's all one. This is just what everybody knows. And they have no concept of faith. They don't need a concept of faith. It's only once you start getting this separation between science and other things that people think they know when maybe they don't, that's when the idea of faith looms and becomes a very attractive idea. And indeed it is. It protects the idea of God from disproof.
Why is this of such concern to you, Dan? If my faith doesn't pick your pocket or break your bone, as Thomas Jefferson said, why should you care what I believe?
Well, exactly. I wouldn't accept that religious people care so much about what everybody else believes. Why do they care? Why do Christians care what Muslims believe? Why do Muslims care what Christians believe? And to me, the really dangerous thing about religion, and this is not everybody, of course, it's not half, thank goodness, but it's many, and that is, the one thing that I think is really dangerous in many religions is that it gives people a gold-plated excuse to stop thinking.
To stop thinking?
To stop thinking. To say, I don't have to think about that because my religion says this is right, this is wrong, it's as clear as that, it's black and white, I don't have to think about this anymore. It's just a matter of faith. And we honor that. We say, oh, it's a matter of faith. I think we have to stop honoring people for stopping thinking. I think we have to say to people, fine, you have your faith, great. Your job then, your duty to your own faith, is to explain to those of us who do not share your faith why you're right about this. Let it be true that God told you. Let it be absolutely true. God told you this is the right way and these ways are wrong. Right. Your problem now is to explain to those of us that God didn't speak to why this is right.
But as that story I told of what happened in the Presbyterian Church in Austin when the Christians denounced the minister for allowing an atheist in the congregation, and the atheist denounced the atheist for surrendering to the superstition of the church. You can't have a real dialogue between people who say, I'm speaking for God, and people who say there is no God to speak.
Well,
can you?
I don't see why not. It seems to me that those people who have their faith, who believe so strongly in God, if they really believe strongly their God, they believe they're right, they believe that they occupy the moral high ground, they should be only too willing to sit down and put this not to the scientific test, but to the political, moral discussion test of talking about why they believe what they believe. And let's talk about, the main thing we want to talk about is, what should we do? What's the moral course of action to take? And if that is to be a reasonable discussion, we have to take a few cards off the table.
Such as?
The faith card. We have to take the faith card off the table.
What do you mean take the faith card off the table? I mean, if one is a man of faith, one can't take the gene out.
Well, you know, Lucille says you're wrong. You know who Lucille is? She's a friend of mine. She's always right. I can't play that card in an argument. It's just rude of me to say, you know, Lucille says you're wrong. You say, well, who's Lucille? I say, well, friend of mine, always right. End of the discussion.
But we're confronted today by people who say they know the mind of God.
And I think the way we should deal with them is to say, well, that's very interesting, because now you've got a real problem. Since the rest of us don't know the mind of God, we can't share your direct line, so you're going to have to do the best you can in a secular discussion about what the right thing to do is. Are you up to the task of explaining to the rest of us who don't have your hotline to God why you're right? And don't just tell me that God told you. We know that. We accept that.
Suppose I'm sitting here, I'm a Muslim, and I say to you, look, book 5, verse 44 condemns apostasy, and it says the heretic should be put to death. And I'm telling you that this is my holy script, and I believe that is the case. What do you say to me?
I say, well, the fact that it says it in your holy text is an interesting historical fact, but it doesn't settle whether it's right. It just doesn't.
But it settles for me, speaking for the Muslim, that it's true.
Well, it is possible, of course, that many people are simply morally incapacitated for engaging in moral deliberation.
How come? You have to do it. Would you have to submit that to a scientific test of observation and verification?
If they can't hold a discussion, a reasonable, respectful political discussion about these issues without simply playing the faith card, then I guess they have to admit that they can't defend what they're saying. I think the big problem that we have is we have been too willing just to let people play the faith card, and then it just trumps everything. And it might have been all right, except it's being abused a great deal around the world today. And I think, and besides, nobody believes that. Let's face it. If somebody came up and said, look, my religion says well, I don't have to make up a case. I'm going to take the case of apostasy you just mentioned. There are clerics in Islam right now who say, death for apostasy, that's our religion, and we should do it. And I think everybody in the world should stand up and say, don't be ridiculous. Don't be silly. That is barbaric. It is simply beyond the pale. It doesn't matter what your tradition is. This is not a tradition that should be honored.
Yeah, the church once put, the Catholic Church once put heretics to the stake.
Absolutely right. And they've learned better, haven't they?
They have learned.
And I think we should not be afraid to say to the Muslim world, come on, wake up. We made this mistake in the past too, we Christians, but we're not making it anymore. We Jews, that certainly Christians and Jews certainly made that mistake in the past.
When I read this book, there were so many themes running through it. You'll see my margins are pink and red and yellow.
Oh, but that's what I wanted to do.
But the thing I wrote in one margin was, you were talking here, in effect, about how democracy, how we as a nation in the early days made an agreement to avoid absolutes. We said we're going to put absolutes off the table when it comes to questions of religion. That's what some people call the separation of church and state. It was that we will not organize our politics around the battle for absolutes. Do you see that in danger today?
Yeah, I do indeed. I think we're living at a time where it's time for people really to stand up and be counted and make very clear where they stand on the separation of church and state.
I saw a sign the other day. I'm for a bumper sticker. I'm for the separation of church and hate. Interesting.
Well, yes, that's good too. You know, in the book I tell the story which you will remember, younger readers won't, of Charlie Wilson when Eisenhower wanted to appoint him to be his Secretary of Defense. This was 50 years ago. And Wilson was the CEO of General Motors. And he said, or was reported to have said, that what's good for General Motors is good for the country. And he was jumped on by everybody. And they said, wait a minute. And actually what he said was, what's good for the country is good for General Motors and vice versa. But what they said is, look, even if you're right, that what's good for General Motors is good for the country, we want to know, what would you do if push came to shove? What if in some instance, some policy you had to decide as Secretary of Defense, you could see that what was good for the country wasn't necessarily good for General Motors? Then where would your first priority be? They wanted to make sure that his priority was what's good for the country, not what's good for General Motors. And they required him to put his holdings in a blind trust and all the rest of that. Now, imagine a politician today saying, well, what I've always believed is what's good for the Baptist Church is good for the country. I don't think we should stand for that. I think we should make the same human cry. We should say, hang on, we don't mind you having your priorities that way, but if that's what your priorities are, I think we want somebody else to be in office, because we want people that we have in office to put the preservation of the democracy, the preservation of the...
So he's hard to stop, but there are plenty of such videos of him explaining things, various topics, and so on. This is associated with his book Breaking the Spell, which came out, remember he's associated with that you know, the four horsemen, so-called, of the new atheists. And Richard Dawkins came out with his book, I can't think of the title of it offhand, and Sam Harris had one, The End of Faith, I think it was, but so they all, and and Christopher Hitchens' book was God is Not Great, was one of the ones that came out. So they were all doing this, and I think what they were really trying to do was embarrass people for believing in traditional religions, with the goal of making it difficult for young people to join religions anymore. You know, so they're really trying to push the idea that you're either going to be a modern person, a scientist, or you're going to be primitive, backward, and believe in these traditional superstitions. And I think the reason that they were motivated to do that was to try to prevent further 9/11 incidents, terrorism of that sort. That's what I think stimulated all four of them to come together and do this. But now, of the four, Richard Dawkins always refers to himself as an atheist. Christopher Hitchens certainly did as well. And Sam Harris is interesting because he also feels he believes in a certain spirituality. And Waking Up was his latest book, as I recall. But for Daniel Dennett, what's interesting in this discussion, and I didn't find it, that might be here.
Now, you wouldn't explain that as a trick, would you?
Trick is a pejorative term. First of all, yes, we can do this, and we can show how religions do their tricks too, and every
well, but the point he makes at this somewhere in this point is that he points out he accepts the definition of God given in the ontological argument, and agrees that, well, of course, if that's what you mean by God, of course God exists, because the logical necessity of that argument forces it. right? But of course, then the problem is that, well, by definition, then God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. And that's the only thing you can say about God. And that's very frustrating to practically everyone, you know, because everyone wants really to be able to say specific virtues of some sort, certain values are associated with God, right? That's the real issue for them. Not to just say that, well, whenever you refer to God, of course you're referring to something that exists and created the universe, but that's all we know about it, right? You know, that frustrates the heck out of folks. And frankly, that's appealing to me that he says that, because I agree with that in the same sense that he does. And I can agree with his critiques of the kinds of superstitions that people believe in today as problematic. You know, we just have come from an Easter weekend where over 300 people in Sri Lanka have been killed because of this same kind of religious-based terrorism. So clearly, whatever we can do to try to prevent that kind of event, that behavior by people, would be fantastic. And if they're saying that that was in response to what happened in New Zealand a month ago, I don't know that there was any such connection. Of course, it could be anybody saying that kind of thing, but there you've got this dilemma that people are using this flag waving associated with a superstitious tradition to kill people, and that's certainly an admirable goal on the part of these four individuals to try to prevent that kind of thing continuing to happen. So I find that very interesting. But of the four individuals, he's the only one I've heard that refers to the ontological argument as still working, and that I love that, because I think it annoys the heck out of people when I argue that. What else? But you get the idea of how he talks. He's also given the Gifford lectures. Notice he was a student of Quine. He also studied with Gilbert Ryle. Gilbert Ryle's most famous thing was in describing Descartes and describing Descartes' mind-body dualism as the ghost in the machine. That came from him. So looking at his books goes way back, Brainstorms. So these are really early. Notice that's 78. So he was involved in consciousness and the nature of consciousness pretty much from the beginning of his career. And it's funny the way he explains how when he goes to a party and everybody all asks, what do you do? And he says, I'm a philosophy teacher, and their faces all cloud over, But if he's in a party with a large number of faculty from a university and they ask him, oh, what curriculum are you involved with? And he says, oh, philosophy, and their faces all kind of cloud over, because, that's, oh, philosophy, right? But then when he's in a party with all philosophers, and they all, oh, and what is your specialty? And he says, consciousness, then their faces turn into a growl, because, that's like, nobody thinks you could find out anything about consciousness. Of course, that was years ago, and things have changed, etc. But, so philosophy of mind is part of what he's interested in. And with regard to evolution, his book is Darwin's Dangerous Idea, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, which is actually, I think, the best book on Darwin and evolution that I've read. I do recommend Stephen Jay Gould's The Structure of Evolutionary Theory. But that's a major work. That's 1,000+ pages, a history of the evolution of evolutionary theory. But if you're interested in just getting a basic way of understanding what the evolutionary theory is all about, his book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, I found really intriguing. And it was that book that pointed, I was familiar with Herbert Spencer's line, survival of the fittest, for, of course, quite some time. But it was in reading this book that it dawned on me that what we're really looking at is the passing on of the complex system of, because all organisms die, unless you're a fungus. I think there's some fungi that are just absolutely long-lived, et cetera. But if you think all mammals die at least, so none of us will live forever. But we can pass on our genes, and that gets passed on then from generation to generation. So we're passing on our complex system in kind of an evolved, of course, arrangement. You might also point out, as he doesn't do, although he mentioned memes in that discussion, and that's an old discussion, by the way, but he mentions memes, and you might also think in terms of Susan Blackmore and the idea of passing on your memes. That's really, I remember my children were all adopted, but I'm actively trying to pass on my interests, my memes, so to speak, to others. So in that sense, I'm trying to pass on a complex system, my favorite, etc. So that's an interesting book. The Breaking the Spell he was talking about with that interview with Bill Moyers. He also, this is one of his more recent ones, 2017, From Bacteria to Bach and Back, and it's on the nature of complex systems. So that's pretty interesting. And also, of course, on artificial intelligence, right? Can we create artificial intelligence with human-like comprehension and agency? And of course, this leads us to the worrisome characteristics of what superintelligence might be like. And by the way, there's already superintelligence out there if we think about what this will mean. This book, Superintelligence, points out that within 10 years, or already now, we're going to have computers running things of various sorts. And these are now going to be able to think for themselves in certain ways because they're being programmed to solve problems themselves. So they're not just doing what we code telling them to do, but the code will include codes for them to figure out their own coding in order to solve problems that haven't been pre-expected, so to speak, in their software, right? So what we're going to have are essentially then computers that think for themselves in certain respects. I would think about the nature of self-driving cars, trying to solve dilemmas and so on. That's certainly something that's going to happen. So the concern then that Nick Bostrom brings up in this book is, well, what's going to happen when we give computers the kind of power over us that requires them to think kindly of us and treat us nicely? How are we going to program computers to be basically ethical? We're going to have to figure out enough complex computer code to prepare these computers to be ethical and treat human beings nicely. By the way, Asimov's 3 laws of robots are not going to be sufficient, because those are too ambiguous, right? The problem, of course, is that we have not actually solved the dilemma of ethics, even for ourselves. So when we think about, remember my cognitive map, and we think about the various traditional ethical theories, the deontological theory, which says we know what the ethical response is to a particular dilemma, the utilitarian that recognizes that our ethics has to evolve as we learn new tricks and so on, the communitarian that argues that the most important thing, of course, is the entire community, whereas the virtue ethicist is the one that's focused on the flourishing of the individual. So, hey, why should I worry about those 100 people over there when I'm the only one here with pizza, right? You know, I'm going to eat the whole pizza and save what I can't eat for later. I'm not going to say, hey, 100 people over there, I have a pizza, come and share, because that'll just cause a riot, etc. You know, no one will get enough that way. This way, hey, I'm the one with the pizza. You know, maybe I'll just feed my family and not tell anyone outside of the tent, etc. Right? Sorry, I'm thinking of a scenario where I'm a migrant on one of those islands, you know, and there's hundreds of us in various tents, and somehow I managed to get a pizza and everyone else is starving. An actual, real kind of possibility. Okay, so this is interesting because obviously before we start programming computers to tell them how to be ethical, we have to figure out how to be ethical ourselves, and guess what? There's no chance that we're going to solve that problem anytime soon, but beware, computers are already starting to take over things, and we don't know whether they're going to have a red light on or a blue light. Nobody gets that. You know, there's, well, sorry, you know, red light, they're dangerous. Pardon?
You're talking about iRobot? When the
Yes.
iRobot turns red?
Yes, they turn red. Uh-oh, we're in trouble. As long as they're blue, yes, they like us. But as soon as they turn red, they're going to be taking us out. So that's going to happen. That's a big issue, as you can imagine. And he talks about it too, etc. But so here's the list of books: Brainstorm, Elbow Room, and he's very readable, by the way. The Mind's Eye with Douglas Hofstadter, who is also another favorite of mine. I've mentioned him. The Intentional Stance, that one. Consciousness Explained. This one is pretty famous, although notice it is 1992, so we've learned a lot about consciousness since. Darwin's Dangerous Idea, Evolution and the Meanings of Life, Kinds of Minds, Brain Children, Freedom Evolves, and this book is kind of interesting because it, of course, engages in the free will debate and argues that, of course, free will, from a scientific point of view, is explainable as a result of the prior circumstances. So it's causally linked. So it's not like there's magic. You know, this happens, this happens, this happens, and then there's a miracle, and this happens, right? He's not saying that. That's obviously false. From a particular context of the way we talk about things, a scientist has to explain everything as being determined from prior causes. But at the same time, as our complexity increases, our opportunities increase also. So that when I was a kid in college and I was trying to do research on a term paper, the library was my resource. And of course I had the index cards in the library catalog, literally going through the stacks and reading the books using the index of the book and so on. In fact, by the way, there are books that are indexes themselves. I actually still have some copies of that, like an index that's a list of all of the resources available on John Dewey. You know, who the heck would use that anymore, right? You know, because of course you can now have greater freedom of just going to the internet, typing in John Dewey what was John Dewey thinking about handicapped children, or something. And you'll find the answer, and you wouldn't have to be limited to just what books are locally available to you. You, of course, can find a lot of digital availability there. Same way I, of course, do the class. I mean, we couldn't have used these kinds of resources just in, the mid-90s. Those kinds of availability were not there, right? But now I have the freedom to use all these kinds of resources because, in that sense, freedom has evolved. Does that make sense? Same thing with regard to all sorts of things, thanks to technology. Do you have to travel to Orléans to go see the cathedral there and say, gee, this looks an awful lot like Notre Dame, right? Oh, that's New Orleans. I don't want that. Why is it all Louisiana? Do I have to say France? It's the 1812 overture. That's just totally wrong. I can't believe they're playing that for this. Because the 1812 overture is about how the Russians beat the French. This is Orléans. If anything, the flying buttresses are a little bit heavy. Rose window. By the way, one of the rose windows is dedicated to Jeanne d'Arc, the Maid of Orléans. There's also a statue of her outside the church, etc. It was kind of neat. For Easter, at one point, I used my Oculus Rift to go visit this cathedral, and one of the chapels was so beautiful, I actually, while wearing the Oculus, knelt down on my rug in my living room and thought of myself as praying in that chapel. And the only thing that screwed it up was I was also listening to the TV, and what was on the TV was totally wrong, for that environment. But I thought, hey, I could put Gregorian chant on, and that would be like really cool. Just so you know, I hadn't looked that up prior to my thinking of it to do that. But notice, just thinking of it enabled, with these modern tools available, what I thought was there. And I could just put that on there to show you. Wow. As you can imagine, 10, 15 years ago, that would have been impossible. Obviously, in that sense, our freedom to do things has evolved. Intuition pumps, by the way, and other tools for thinking are his analysis of logical tools and how they developed. And it's not just the logical tools, but it's also the ideas that push us into our next evolutionary stage as conscious individuals. So if you look at the history, for example, of philosophy, and you think, what question did Socrates, prompt Euthyphro, for example, that is considered still today one of the more significant questions that you could use to talk to that person that says, this is what the Quran says, and I believe it. And you could say, well, did the gods love the pious because it was so pious, or did the pious become the pious because the gods loved it, right? So in a sense, you could ask them to think for themselves. That's essentially what that question does. We can think for ourselves whether or not what the gods tell us to do is right or not. And that's, of course, questioning the authority of the priesthood and the Quran or the Bible or whatever, right? But that's just one particular intuition pump. And there's a book full of them, which is absolutely fascinatingly done, etc. Caught in the Pulpit, by the way, was an interesting book. This is his interviews with people who were ministers or priests in various religions who, as a result of their continuing, and this is a dilemma a lot of ministers have, priests as well, that if they're young people, which is when you decide what you want to do, you go into seminary and you learn what the theology is of your particular church, right? And then you get your job, and you go out and you start off maybe as a minister in a small church somewhere in a rural community or something, and you learn the hard way of how to work with people in all the different sort of dilemmas that they have, and so on. And if you do well, then you get promoted to a bigger church with more income. And by the way, more income usually also means a little bit better parish house, or benefits for the ministers, so that the more important your particular church that you're working in, the better your benefits, right? So that's how they get promoted, is by being good at various things. But also, as you're studying and preparing for your weekly sermons and things, you're also learning. And the thing that happens to a lot of people is that as they progress and they learn more themselves, they begin having doubts about the various dogmas associated with their particular sect. And then they end up in a situation where they're caught in the pulpit. And the problem is that, well, this is their career, and they might also have a family, and all their benefits and their income and everything is all dependent on them preaching in this particular church sect. But at the same time, they no longer believe what they're supposed to be teaching. So then what do they do, right? And I've met some ministers who are in a position where what they decide to do is be radical and teach what they themselves have started to discover, despite the fact that it's critical of the sect's dogma. And that causes nothing but controversy. One of the people that did that was Bishop Spong, who's written some books. For example, Christianity Must Change or Die, for example. He wants to reform Christianity and completely change it from the basic dogma of the tradition to one that completely fits science. Well, the problem, of course, is that not everyone in the church is, of course, fond of this whole idea, and in fact, it's one of the reasons. He's an Episcopal bishop, by the way, and the Episcopal Church literally is declining in membership. In fact, recently they joined with the Lutheran Church in North America in order to help bolster their combined numbers. But the mainline churches are losing population. The fundamentalist churches are gaining. And those are not all necessarily, of course, in the United States. It's the worldwide Episcopal Church is still growing, but it's mostly the more what they call low church believers in especially Africa that are doing that. Methodism, the same, right? The ministers that want to argue science and want to change the traditions of the church end up having difficulties with their membership, because not everyone's got the time to do their kind of research and so on, and literally they end up being kicked out one way or the other. Shelby Spong was kind of forced out various ways, etc. So that's one choice that people that feel like they no longer believe what they were taught to believe when they were younger. That's the approach they go, because they want to keep their position, but at the same time they don't want to be lying to people about what they believe, right? But the other opportunity is for you to leave the church. And in fact, what you can do is, in a sense, progress, if you call it that, up the various levels of the more ambiguous churches. So as you look at the mainline churches, there's actually kind of a chain of relationships between dogma where they get more and more abstract. So for example, Unitarians, Unitarian Universalists. We have a fellowship in Anchorage, the Anchorage Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and the dogma, so-called, the principles that the fellowship accepts are so ambiguous that dolphins are members. Just so you don't believe me? Oh, well, this is hilarious. Let's see if I can find it just this way. Take hold, and so where's the do you see
The things that pop out.
I'm looking for the principles. Maybe under the mission? Principles, hello, give me some principles.
It's the second bullet point under the introduction on the very bottom.
Second on the very bottom?
Yeah, under an introduction. So our beliefs, discovery,
I see.
and core values.
Oh, here. Is that it?
Oh.
There should be 7. Ah, here we go. So these are the 7 principles. That's essentially, if you believe these, you're welcome to be, you're welcome to be a member anyway, because they don't care, but in any case, these are the principles you're supposed to accept if you do choose to become a member. The inherent worth and dignity of every person. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And by the way, if you define person as I do, a dolphin is a person, an elephant's a person, etc., right? Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience, and the use of the democratic process within our congregation and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are part. Notice that those are all wonderfully ambiguous, so that they don't actually require you in any specific kind of action whatsoever. And so basically I'm convinced that dolphins are perfectly good UUs. And by the way, this is also one of the smallest churches of mainline churches in the United States, because it's so ambiguous and abstract. So, and by the way, it's mostly in New England, the New England states. And by the way, I think you have to also be a liberal Democrat to be a member. If you're a Republican and you say something, you will be totally misinterpreted in a way that will make it seem like what you said was something that was liberal and Democrat. That's hilarious. Could be fun. You could be laughing at this. And yes, I've been a member since 1995, so I'm familiar with. In fact, I was president one year, so that's kind of fun too. But that's the most abstract you can get. You can get to that point and not have any remaining detritus from your seminary days. Actually, they have a seminary, but it's basically a seminary that encourages you to study all religions and respect all of them. They actually have all sorts of, there's actually a witches' coven as a part of the fellowship. It's just so you know. So the point then that he makes, Daniel Dennett, in his book, Caught in the Pulpit, is, and by the way, not everyone he interviews wants to leave the pulpit, etc. In fact, it reminds me of, did you ever see the movie Religulous? Bill Maher's movie, Religulous? There's some points that both of them make that I think are similar in that way. So I need a good quiz question today. On the way over here, I thought of a terrific one, and now I can't remember what it was. But
you have to understand one thing about directing, that
so here is the beginning of Brahms's Requiem. And remember, he was saying how even without a particular religious faith, you could find a lot of the stories, and especially the music, very meaningful. So do you find religious music meaningful? How's that as a quiz question? Do you find religious music meaningful? Can you hear me, by the way? Is this thing working? This music while going to Orleans Cathedral and going to that one chapel on the side in the back that I thought was really beautiful. It was red, white, and blue. Very therapeutic. Therapy, by the way, is Greek for care of the self. Therapia. Only one class left before finals. This looks like clickbait, doesn't it? It wants us to go to another. Too much fun. Any questions?
It's fun.
Oh, I should mention tonight at 7 o'clock at the library is a lecture, or not a lecture, but a presentation of student papers by Raymond Anthony's students in environmental ethics. And free food, if you're interested, in the library.
Free food.
Free food. And I'm sure it's going to be ethically, environmentally safe food
I will.
because of the circumstance. I mean,